So if you're a beginner or an early intermediate home bartender, meaning you're within the first 2 years of your home bartending journey, and you're wondering what exact category of cocktails you should focus the vast majority of your efforts on, then this is the correct video for you. My name is Ron Virpin. I'm a full-time medical doctor, and I've been a home bartender for over 5 years now. During that time, I learned how to make over 100 different cocktails, and I've thrown over 50 cocktail parties. And I teach other busy professionals how to make cocktails at home. And by the end of this video, you'll understand which of the three primary categories of cocktails you should focus all of your effort or the vast majority of your effort on, especially if you're in the first 2 years of your home bartending journey. And I like to divide cocktails into these three main categories, and there are a lot of different ways to divide cocktails. You can divide them based on the recipe, for example, or the template. But in this video, I'm going to be talking specifically on the categorization by timeline, by the history of the cocktails. And there are three broad ranges of cocktails, and in order, going in order from chronologically oldest to newest, those three categories are going to be classic cocktails, modern classic cocktails, and then finally craft cocktails. And the exact timelines, there's no hard and fast rules, but just as a general rule of thumb, I think of classic cocktails as pre-1950s. And the main historical event in that time period is Prohibition, which is the era of primarily in the 1920s when alcohol was considered illegal in the United States. And a lot of these recipes are actually from the Prohibition era or even the pre-Prohibition era, meaning they're from the very early part of the 1900s or even the late 1800s in some cases. Then modern classics, they're thought of as being from the year 2000 onwards. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was really, for lack of a better term, something called the cocktail renaissance, also called the, essentially also called the craft cocktail movement. And this is where a lot of new and innovative bartenders, especially in New York City, but also throughout other parts of the United States and the world, were really starting to put their own spin on, they were not only revitalizing and bringing back the classic recipes from the early 1900s and late 1800s, they were also putting their own spin and creating riffs on those cocktails. And a lot of them became essentially instant classics, or what the movement calls modern classic cocktails. And these are cocktails that, although they are not very new, they are still very popular, and they essentially have the same popularity as classic cocktails. So that's why I like to call them instant classics. Within just a few years, or even just within the first year of them being created, they were already considered classic cocktails. And I think of them also as riffs or spin-offs or modifications of the classic cocktails. For example, one of the most well-known and probably my favorite modern classic cocktail is called the penicillin, which is a riff and a better version of the whiskey sour. And the whiskey sour is a classic cocktail over 100 years old. That's the foundation, and then the penicillin builds off that and creates something even better. Another great example is the Oaxacan Old Fashioned, another one of my absolute favorite cocktails, and that is a spin-off or a riff on the classic whiskey Old Fashioned, which is also over 100 years old. And it's kind of interesting because in some of those cases, the classic cocktail is actually more well-known and more ordered at bars and more in people's minds than the modern classics. But the modern classics are, I think of them as better versions of those classic cocktails. And then finally, the newest movement, or the newest category of cocktails is craft cocktails. These are cocktails just within the last few years. The other major historic event, so we talked about Prohibition in the early part of the 1900s and 1920s. Then we talk about the whole craft cocktail movement and the cocktail renaissance of the 1990s and 2000s. And then the third major event in the timeline of cocktails is the COVID-19 pandemic, which happened in 2020 primarily, but also within a few years after that as well. And craft cocktails are generally cocktails that are very new. They're from 2025 or some other period in the 2020s. They're really new. And they're cocktails that are, I like to think of them as their unique cocktails. So if you go to a specific bar or restaurant and there's something on that menu and you don't recognize the name, that is most likely going to be a craft cocktail. That is a cocktail that is unique to that bar or that restaurant. And also, if you're more advanced of a home bartender like myself, you will also create your own cocktails at some point. There are several cocktails that I have created, and those are also considered craft cocktails. So craft cocktails are cocktails that are not yet in the larger canon of classic cocktails or modern classic cocktails, but they are still cocktails that people will drink if they go specifically to that bar or that restaurant, or they have, or if you're like myself, it's specific to that home bartender or that professional bartender. So they're cocktails that are just unique to that, either that bar or that restaurant or that bartender, whether it's home or professional bartender. So I can't really think of examples or come up with examples off the top of my head for craft cocktails, because craft cocktails, essentially, you go to a high-end cocktail bar, you see something on that menu, that is a craft cocktail. So there's hundreds and thousands of them, probably I would say thousands of them, just because there's so many bars throughout the United States and throughout the world as well. So those are the broader three categories. I can think of a few other examples as well for modern classics. Other examples, I mentioned the Oaxacan Old Fashioned and the penicillin. There's also the Gold Rush, and then there's also the Paper Plane. So those are, and the Naked and Famous. So these are a couple other examples. And primarily, modern classics are built off of the classic cocktails. And the classic cocktails are the cocktails that most people think about when they think about cocktails. If I ask you guys to name 10 cocktails, 15 cocktails, 20 cocktails, probably 90% or even 100% of the cocktails you would name would be classic cocktails. So examples would be Old Fashioned, Negroni, Martini, Margarita, Daiquiri, Sidecar, Moscow Mule, Dark and Stormy, Paloma, Last Word, Ramos Gin Fizz. So these are the fundamental cocktails. These are cocktails that were from that period, late 1800s, early 1900s. And these are what all of the modern classics and the craft cocktails are built off of. So that's why I would say, of the three categories, the one that you should focus on, especially if you're within the first 2 years of your home bartending journey, and even more true if you're within just the first 3 to 6 months of your home bartending journey, you should focus on classic cocktails. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The primary reason is that all of the newer cocktails, so when you're learning modern classic cocktails, as I mentioned with the examples earlier in the video, those are all based and built off of classic recipes. So you have to understand the template first before you can understand the modern classics, which in a lot of cases, there are actually better versions of classic cocktails, but you have to start with the classics because those are the fundamentals of cocktails. And then when you get to a more advanced stage like myself, and you want to build out your own recipes and create your own craft cocktails, then it's even more important that you understand the fundamentals, because I would say pretty much all modern classic and craft cocktails are all built off of the templates that were established with the classic cocktails. So you have to master the classic cocktails. So that's why the majority of my cocktail videos on this channel, at least so far, are in the classic cocktails. And I'm going to be looking to go even further into doing classic cocktails and focusing even more on that as I go forward, because I really want to help home bartenders that are in that early phase, the first 2 years of their home bartending journey, because this is a channel that I wish I had when I was first starting, because I really wanted to learn cocktails the correct way. And the correct order to learn cocktails is to start with those fundamentals, the classic cocktails. So in addition to being a fundamental, the other reason I find classic cocktails to be the most important to learn is something called the Lindy effect. And the Lindy effect essentially applies to all non-living things. So primarily ideas and concepts. And in this case, it includes recipes. So not just simple ideas and concepts, but actually recipes for drinks and cocktails. And what it says is that for non-living things, the longer something has been around, what it means is that it's going to be around for even longer. So the longer something's been around, the longer it'll continue to be around for. And that's in stark contrast to living things like humans, plants, or animals, where for living things, the longer something's been around, that means the shorter it'll actually be around going forward, because living things all have a finite lifespan. So if a human, plant, or animal has already lived for this long, it means they don't have that much longer left. And that's the opposite. The opposite is true for non-living things like ideas, concepts, and recipes. So something that's been around for a long time is something that's going to still be around for a long time. And there's a couple of reasons this is important. One is that if you're getting into this home bartending journey early like I did, I started when I was 27 years old. So if you're also in your 20s or 30s, then you want to learn cocktails not just for now, but if you see this being a lifelong hobby or a hobby that you're going to do for 10, 20, 30 years, something like that, then you want to learn recipes that will still be around then. So with classic cocktails, you know that they've already been around for 100 years. And even in the year 2025, all those classic cocktails I listed, they're still extremely popular. They're still extremely well-liked. And people will ask for them when they come to your home bar. And they'll not only ask for them today in the year 2025, but 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, even 50 years from now, I can almost guarantee that 50 years from now, people are still going to be drinking old fashions. People are still going to be drinking margaritas. People are still going to be drinking martinis and Manhattans and Negronis and these kind of cocktails. I can't necessarily say this the same is true for modern classic, and I definitely can't say the same is true for craft cocktails. These cocktails are just too new. They haven't stood the test of time. Some of them have been around maybe 20, 25 years, but you can't really definitively say that they'll still be around later on in your home bartending journey. Whereas classic cocktails, you know for a fact, these drinks have been around 100 plus years. You know that people are still going to be drinking them. They're so well ingrained into the whole cocktail canon that people are still going to be drinking them many, many years from now. So if you're getting into this home bartending journey, that's why it's so important to learn classic cocktails first, because those are cocktails that you're going to be making today and many, many, many years from now. That's not going to be the case for craft cocktails, and it may not even be the case for modern classic cocktails. It's still a little too early to know for that. So I would say those are the two main reasons to focus on classic cocktails. One is that classic cocktails are the fundamentals of home bartending and bartending in general. So you have to start with the fundamentals before you can start learning modern classics, and definitely before you can start making your own cocktails. And the other reason is the Lindy effect, meaning that these cocktails, because they've been around for so long, these are cocktails that are going to persist even longer. And even if you are somebody who's getting into home bartending later on in your life, in your 50s, 60s, something like that, it's still important to learn classic cocktails. And the Lindy effect is still relevant because these are cocktails that people are going to like these cocktails because they have really stood the test of time. I think that's one of the most important things for a recipe. If it's been around for a long time, that means people have enjoyed it in various decades, and people's tastes have changed throughout the years and things like that, and people have still enjoyed these classic cocktails. That's why they're so important. So anyways, just to summarize, there are three primary categories of cocktails. Classic cocktails from 1950 and earlier, modern classics from after the cocktail renaissance and the craft cocktail movement of the early 2000s, and then finally craft cocktails, which are just from the last few years. There is that in-between period of 1950 to 2000, sort of a dead zone for cocktails because cocktails lost popularity, and alcohol in general lost popularity after Prohibition in the 1920s, before the whole revitalization in the late 90s and early 2000s. So there is that dead zone. There are a few cocktails created in that. Some people do categorize them with modern classics. So examples of that would be the Espresso Martini, the Bramble, and the Cosmopolitan, which are all great cocktails. But there were not a whole lot of great cocktails created during that period. There's a lot of great cocktails in the modern classic time period and a lot from the classic time period. That in-between period, not so much. So to summarize, I would just focus on those three main areas: classic, modern classic, and craft. And of those three, if you're within the first 2 years of your home bartending journey, focus on classic cocktails because those are the fundamentals of bartending, and also because those recipes have stood the test of time, which means they are going to be recipes that you will learn that you are learning not only for today as a home bartender, but for your future 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. You're still going to be making the classic cocktail recipes because they have stood the test of time. Anyways, that's all I have for today's video. If you found the advice in this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel below. I really like to do two types of videos on this channel. One will be like this type of video where I share stories from my home bartending journey and give general advice and tips and tricks that I feel will help you guys all become better home bartenders. And the second type of video is where I do tutorials on how to make specific cocktails. Anyways, that's all I have for this video. Thank you. Cheers.